Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. In today's review, we are delving back into Doctor Who's 60th anniversary celebrations at Big Finish with Once and Future in the 8th and final story, entitled Coda, the Final Act, as written by Tim Foley, featuring the debut of the Fugitive Doctor at Big Finish alongside the younger War Doctor. Now, it does feel very odd returning to Once and Future. It's very deja vu, because it feels like this story is done with by now, but we have one final story to end out the range, pretty much a whole year on from the series originally. Now, as a quick reminder, because it has been a year, there is a standard version of Once and Future available now on CD and download. There is also the deluxe version with exclusive cover artwork. This is now sold out. It is the bundle version, and it's sold out a long time ago, but content-wise, it is exactly the same between the two releases. Now, I'm going to start off this review by answering a question which no doubt a few people will be wondering, especially if you're in the camp who haven't listened to Once and Future. Due to this story having the debut of the Fugitive Doctor, it will be attracting an audience that perhaps didn't listen to Once and Future. Can you enjoy this story, having not listened to those previous episodes? And to be honest, the answer is yes. Coda is a separate story, really, to the rest of Once and Future. One of the ways I can describe it is, you know, when they release a book in hardback, and then a year later it's released in paperback, and sometimes, particularly if it's, say, a biography, it will have a new exclusive chapter tacked on the end. That's basically what Coda is. You can experience this story or not, and it will not impact the overall experience of listening to Once in the Future. The main plot arc is done with, this is just an additional strand. So it's a story where time is going a little bit unusual, the aftershocks of the degeneration which ran for the course of the entirety of Once and Future, but there's still a few things left to tie up. If anything, it's quite apt that this episode has weird time things going on, as it does feel very weird reviewing Once and Future a year on from its initial release. The story and its placement did always baffle me a little bit when Once in the Future originally came out, seeing that there was an episode a whole year later, and part of me thinks maybe it's a production thing, maybe there was a rights issue with the Fugitive Doctor, and there was needing to be a certain time that had passed since the 13th Doctor era perhaps, in order for them to release a story with her in publicly. It is good timing given the debut of her main series in early 2025. And to be honest, I am quite thankful for this story's degree of separation from the main plot arc of Once and Future, because I've forgotten the vast majority of it by this point, because time has moved on since. But do be prepared, if you haven't listened to the other stories, there may be the occasional reference here and there that you will not fully understand, but I don't think it detracts from the overall enjoyment of this story. So the concept of this episode is rather intriguing. We have two forgotten doctors, pretty much, an invention of New Who. The War Doctor is now expertly played by Jonothan Carley. I've grew very familiar and fond with his performance through the beginnings series. He captures this sadness and charm of the War Doctor so well, and there's a great depth within Carley's voice. There's a dryness which works really well on audio, yet also because of the whole concept of Once and Future, it being more accessible to a wider audience, I do think that maybe the War Doctor is a little bit less down in the dumps within this series. He's slightly chirpier. He doesn't have to deal with perhaps the more bleak aspects that we see within his own series. But we do still absolutely feel the character feeling the effects of the Time War still. That is fundamental to this incarnation. And of course, Jo Martin's debut as the audio version of the Fugitive Doctor as well, which is a big selling point of this release. I'm pleasantly surprised actually of how well Jo Martin does come across on audio. And I think it's so difficult for me to decide if I like us venturing into the Fugitive Doctor era or not, because I think one of the things that I like about the Fugitive Doctor is because she is so unknown, she's so distant, and maybe keeping that whole thing a mystery is the best thing. But at the same time, I do still want to hear and experience more of Jo Martin's Doctor, especially when it's written by the incredibly talented people at Big Finish who can actually utilise the incarnation in exciting ways. Having the Fugitive Doctor within this story I think really works. We have her tracking down a certain war criminal who interferes, no prizes for guessing who that is, and it instantly changes the shape of how we perceive the Doctor. This is someone who has been employed by someone to track someone down, essentially a bit of a bounty hunter, which is not what we expect from a Doctor usually. There is a sharpness. The characteristics that we associate with the Doctor do seem a little bit more distant. There is an element of unpredictability to the Fugitive Doctor, but at the same time, there are a few underlying threads that you do think are very Doctorly. And speaking of bounty hunters, we have Chase Masterson in this story as well as Vienna Salvatore. I didn't look at the casting credits for this release when I started to listen to it, so I was very pleasantly surprised to hear Vienna back. I previously didn't know who Vienna was a few years ago. However, through listening to the Eric Roberts Master series, I've kind of been subliminally lured in to absolutely adore the character, so it's great to see her a part of the 60th anniversary celebrations. She's got a few scenes here and there. She's not a crucial role within the story. If anything, it's more of a cameo. So if you are exclusively a fan of Vienna, who knows, maybe there's a few of you out there, I wouldn't recommend this story on the basis of Vienna alone, because she's not in it much. And to be honest, actually, having Vienna team up with the Fugitive Doctor would be a really interesting thing. The way the dialogue is written within this story is certainly one of its strengths. Again, Tim Foley is excellent with character, and it allows for some of my personal favourite moments within the story. No surprises to say, the Fugitive Doctor does interact with Bernie Summerfield within this episode, so we see Benny interacting with a female incarnation of the Doctor, something of which that we were robbed of in Screen with 13 and Benny, sadly, which should have happened. Why didn't it happen? Ugh. And I really do want to praise Tim Foley for honing in on Benny's relationship with the Doctor, particularly the more unconventional Doctors. There's a moment of reflection as Benny meets Fugitive, realising that this is a Doctor that's very different to the other Doctors that she's met. But she acknowledges, yes, this Doctor is different, yes, they're a bit unusual, but she's used to a Doctor from an entirely different universe, and she refers to those adventures as something that happened within the past. Of course, David Warner's excellent Unbound Doctor, and we hear her refer to that period within her life as wonderful, which actually made me really stop this episode, have a little pause moment to think and reflect on David Warner, of course, who is sadly no longer with us. I just really appreciated that link, that acknowledgement that he's no longer there, that she's perhaps moved on in life, and there's a fondness within the delivery. I think Lisa Bauman does a really good job of portraying the emotion and the reflection within such a simple line. It's really lovely. There is also a pace to the Fugitive Doctor as well, which I'm looking forward to hearing more of within her own series. She holds all of the cards close to her chest. You don't quite know what she's thinking. She's a force of power, one to be reckoned with. Not entirely what you would expect from a Doctor. I don't particularly feel safe with her. It's very much a Seven and Ace relationship, but Seven within his later stories, where he's very mysterious and a little bit sinister at times. And rather than this episode being a multi-Doctor story, it's actually two Doctors basically fighting and trying to one-up one another throughout. Who is who, why they're playing the game that they are playing, and overall it's just a big game of being reckless. Reckless silliness, particularly in regards of the War Doctor, which I quite liked. As always with Tim Foley's writing, he has a way of capturing characters absolutely spot on. Personality-wise, he really gets who he is writing for. It doesn't feel like a cardboard cutout. There's an attention to detail through quirks in speech, references to other events and mannerisms, which really make me believe in the story, even if I can't get behind the narrative itself, that the characters still feel genuine. For characters like Bernice Summerfield, there is a jokiness, a familiarity between her and the Doctor. She's a problem solver, one that is always one step ahead. In fact, Lisa's delivery really put a smile on my face throughout all of this story. Now, if you are familiar with my previous Once and Future episode reviews, you will know that I'm not particularly fond of the jumpy nature of the series, the way that it hops about from planet to planet, and sometimes I think with Doctor Who stories that do that, you kind of lose the story along the way, although it does really add to the travelling time and space element that Doctor Who so loves. I think sometimes it can be very distracting and hard to follow. It's just not my favourite way to tell a story. I do think that I lose interest a little bit as well. As often stories that are formatted like that also are accompanied by techno-babble and things that I simply just don't understand, which, let's face it, makes sense because it's all made up and Time Lords are already really meant to understand it, so I think it just goes over our heads a bit. It certainly goes over mine. Now, this story does have that, which did make me feel a little bit uncertain for a while, but the plot itself, the story, is very easy to follow. It's just two Doctors sort of playing a game between one another, taking it in turns to trap each other, put them in difficult situations. And I love that contrast as well between history meets other worlds and sci-fi. It's really satisfying. Something that Doctor Who does best, blending the absurd. I mean, you have Queen Elizabeth teaming up with the Vord, or fighting against the Vord, which is such a bizarre idea, but the way that it is portrayed is really, really fun, and I think it's a very exciting episode to visualise within the mind. It's something that only really Tim Foley can get away with, because it's so ridiculous, and yet it also holds with it a rather emotional story about identity and the person who you are, or who you are throughout your life, which then ties thematically really well to the War Doctor, who is running from his past, and the Fugitive Doctor, who doesn't have a clue who her past is. But again, if you are listening to this story exclusively for the Vord, it's not really a Vord episode. It's just an episode with the Vord in, and I think, yes, you could technically remove them and replace them with another race entirely, but the fact is the Vord is nice. I didn't feel underserved when it came to the Vord. I kind of got what I thought I'd get from them. So it's a nice collaboration of character. And I think that the crucial thing is it's an episode that exists in its own right and it works as a story, and it just so happens that these characters are in it. It's not like the characters have been decided, then go and create a story with them, and then it falls apart on the storyline side of things, which isn't the case here. I do think the end makes sense. Again, it was all Time Lordy, so I'm not really expected to understand, but I could get behind it. It made sense somewhat as long as I didn't think about it too hard. It's an alright story, it's enjoyable, and I think that it particularly focuses on that dynamic between the War Doctor and the Fugitive Doctor, two doctors that are haunted by struggles, one of which that has lost their memories of who they are, is a little bit confused, and I hope that the Fugitive series picks up on that a little bit more. We have mentions to the Division in there as well, so if you're a 13th Doctor era fan, I imagine that will be really exciting. We also have the War Doctor as well, going through their own troubles, and I like the brief mentions to that, although it's not something that you can explore in depth within a 1 hour story, and it's, I suppose, a little bit of an advertisement for those rather excellent stories within Carley's own individual series as well, which I do highly recommend checking out. And I will say this now, before we get the Fugitive series, before it's released, I just hope the Fugitive Doctor series as a whole has intention behind it. I hope this series has a direction. I want a theme that connects all of the stories together. I want a little bit of a plot arc, as I think, especially when you're establishing a spin-off, that works really well rather than having aimless wanderings. I want each story to have a box set, a theme. It feel like it travelling in a certain direction rather than other series that Big Finish have done in recent years, which don't particularly seem to be going anywhere. They're fun stories, but they don't have an overall objective. But there you go, that's Once and Future complete. For good this time. It's an alright story. I think that if you weren't a fan of Once and Future the first time round, then you probably won't get much from this episode, but I think it's a good story in its own right. It's a nice, enjoyable episode, which embraces what Doctor Who does best. Time travel, bizarre locations, blending history and sci-fi, and very good character in there as well. And I think the way that it blends together New Who and New Who elements, but also, let's face it, some very traditional and niche elements of Big Finish, the likes of Bernie Summerfield and Vienna Salvatore, it works seamlessly into a package. I think it's a collaboration that does work very well, unlike some of the more questionable teamings within this series so far, the likes of like Harry Sullivan and Lady Christina and the Sixth Doctor and Jackie Tyler, which, that was an odd one. So there we go, thank you for watching this review, I really hope you have enjoyed it. Do of course stay tuned on The Host Productions for more Doctor Who content. Have a nice day, and I shall see you all next time.